Hello, everyone. I'm Virginia Mahacek. I'm a principal geomorphologist and leader of the restoration and resiliency practice at WRA, which is an environmental firm celebrating its 40th year in business in the San Francisco Bay Area of California. I'm making a recording of the presentation I gave recently at the Colorado Wildland Fire Conference in Grand Junction. Because my presentation is kind of a multimedia combination, we decided to make a unified video recording to share on the conference website. I served as WRA's manager for a capacity building project that was funded by Rebuild North Bay Foundation that now operates as After the Fire. And I was supporting a core group of volunteer expert advisors that I had first met when they were working on some taking action concepts. And I was in the role as the watershed and natural resource manager at the County of Sonoma's Office of Recovery and Resiliency, which was created after the 2017 North Bay fires. In fact, those are the very fires that our keynote speaker, Brian Fries, had talked about losing his home in. The North Bay region of California has a long history of wildfire activity, and it, especially recently, has experienced repeated, devastating, and deadly fires. WRA's team led a project that gave administrative support, meeting facilitation services, and technical expertise on how to develop a program employing conservation finance, environmental compliance, geospatial analysis, and outreach that would support this group as they transitioned into having an operational structure. They became a distinct entity called Taking Actions for Living Systems, otherwise referred to themselves as TALS. Today, the multimedia presentation is going to be a combination of me as a live presenter and also emceeing by providing video of my colleague Jane Rice, who's based in Denver, Colorado, but wasn't able to be there in person. And also, I have several video shorts that are from virtual panelists, and this can then feature their direct comments and content. The collaborators are some of that original core team and leaders and representatives of existing organizations that have been cooperating to work on connected and parallel efforts. There are serious obstacles ahead, of course, and a heaviness regarding the urgency of making progress, but we hope to be sharing encouraging information about getting on track towards some triple bottom line outcomes on wildfire resilience. The first three video clips provide a bit of motivation and background on distinctive circumstances in our county and the surrounding areas.
We're based in the incredible Dwight Center for Conservation Science, you can see behind me, that is centered in a 3,200 acre research reserve in Sonoma County, California, founded originally as a field station for the California Academy of Sciences. By training, my background is in hydrology and water, but I have been recently brought deeply into fire science, working with our team of interdisciplinary researchers around the world to understand the drivers of fire and to use Pepperwood as a living laboratory, given that we were burnt over 100% essentially in the 2017 Tubbs fire and 60% in the Kincaid fire of 2019. So a unique aspect of us as a field station is that we work as a living laboratory to demonstrate resilience strategies for wildland management. So we've really stepped into a large community dialogue with public safety and first responders, with the housing community, et cetera, and showing how on our own property we can use thinning and other techniques to reduce fuel hazards and increase our water supply. But in addition to that, we're working on a community vision at the scale of Sonoma County and multiple counties of the North Bay of how does our land use need to reflect resilience? How can we achieve a distribution in a rural community with thriving urban centers? Safety, that our wildlands are stewarded in a way that they're not a threat to communities, and that on the other hand, also our communities understand that most fires in our area are human caused. We got involved in thinking about how can we help neighbors link up together to scale up solutions. So instead of trying to remedy a wildfire hazard problem parcel by parcel, how could we develop, say, a plan for an entire mountain community or an entire watershed and help folks to work together and use science to accelerate the process of finding out where the priority areas are and helping to develop solutions.
So we're seeing a geography that's really beset by fire, that has not been historically managed well, that is very constrained, but that's also critical for the health of a number of communities immediately adjacent to these foothills, the Santa Rosa, Windsor, Sonoma, Calistoga, and critical to our wine growing region and the whole North Bay economy and our public health.
And our district is over 800,000 acres, and about half of that is forested. And one thing that is particularly interesting about our county is how much of the county is in private ownership and how much of that is broken up into many, many parcels. And so when we talk about half of our district being privately owned, that translates to somewhere around 15,000 individual owners of forest land within our district. You know, wildfires in Sonoma County have changed so many things about life, and certainly changed things for our organization. And we have gone from a focus on things like erosion control, soil conservation, fisheries restoration, carbon sequestration, stream flow and groundwater conservation, all of those issues. And in 2017, sort of turning on a dime, all of a sudden we realized that we could no longer take a hands-off approach with forest management. And so while our mission has stayed the same and really, you know, kept our work at that intersection of people and natural resources, now we have another issue on our plates. We've added staff with expertise in forestry, and we've really expanded our services to include both post-fire watershed recovery and also work that prepares forests to be more resilient.
So to talk a bit more with a common framework, I wanted to have us revisit the triangle rubrics that are often applied to wildfire. This particular one demonstrates a full range of spatial and temporal scales, from the smallest one representing components of ignition that create a flame, through like the factors that control the character and behavior of a particular wildfire event, as well as some of the landscape and variables and complex feedback that regulate fire regimes. And some of these even broader, longer conceptualizations of like super fire regimes. These type of models help us understand wildfire and its links to ecology, and they serve to help inform wildfire management and response approaches. The triangles are often modified to indicate direct and indirect interactions of humans on these variables. And recently, of course, they've needed to help represent that human interaction is no longer just happening at that flame or the event level. If we flip the switch and we visualize not the fire, but rather wildfire resilience, we can use a rubric similarly to show how we can see both the challenge and the concurrent value of community safety, ecological function, and economic stability. And if we think back and reflect on that nested spatial and temporal scale like shown on the left, it's not hard to see that wildfire resilience also has some like nesting expressions. There's an urgency that it needs to be achieved swiftly and over vast scales. There's a demand that all three elements be sustained over time. And there's the confounding situation of needing to do this in a physical, political, and socially dynamic and uncertain future. So if the wildfire resilience triangle is a simplifying and unifying ultimate goal, it's a combination of both avoided consequences and desired conditions. But how do we get there? WRA developed process model graphics for TALs that could be customized and then organized to show their own ideas and pathways that chart out how connected or parallel efforts by others could contribute to reaching the ultimate goals. They could also use this type of a process graphic to engage and inform stakeholders, and Jane will talk a little bit about that in a bit. But for now, let's just use this graphic to note that getting to the goal requires outcomes that are generated by activities. In the most obvious sense, some of the activities are the ones that are commonly referred to as treatments that reduce wildfire hazard. TALS considers the full spectrum of possible treatment actions as important for discussion with community members, stakeholder groups, and agencies. It can actually be illuminating to see where various folks enter the conversation, what they think is either essential or impossible. And by viewing the full spectrum, it can either help narrow the focus or broaden viewpoints. And along with considering what treatments are needed, of course, the where is critical. But scale is not simply about treatments. Scale is also about geographies of hazards and geographies of benefits. The risks to life and property, the benefits to a community or ecology, as well as treatments, can be at any of these spatial scales. Individual structures, a household, a community, along a corridor that crosses through or in a watershed, and certainly spanning political and regulatory boundaries. Recently, and especially with the increasing size of damaging fires, and with the fact that both the Dixie and the Caldor fires crossed the crest of the Sierra in a previously unheard of manner, we must be forced to think even bigger beyond watersheds to kind of larger physiographic or ecoregions. Okay, this graphic's a little bit hectic, but it's just to indicate that there's kind of an imperfect overlay between treatment categories and spatial scales. And it can help folks group approaches and actions into programs or projects. When you look at this, think about time as the other dimension. Note that only a few of these treatments, regardless of their geographic scale, are one-time actions. Maybe hardening a house or converting a forest to a vineyard. Most of these actions would require repeated cyclical implementation. And that means the treatments are not a cure. They're part of a management program. And if that's the case, they need institutional framework and they need funding to do it over and over. Our panelist clips now are going to talk about this a little bit more.
Throughout California, I think a third of the land that are forests are in private hands. In Sonoma County, it's 87%. That's 487,000 acres in these 17,000 different parcels. They all are beginning to understand the importance of being stewards of their particular spot, but they are still not able to see, for the most part, that they are part of this really important larger ecosystem, a forest ecosystem. People are now, as I said, wanting to understand that. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to do it, and they certainly don't know how to pay for it. If you've ever just picked up a big piece of wood, well, you probably can't pick it up. And that's just a little piece of wood. So everything is that heavy, in terms of not only the wood, but the concepts, what we need to understand. How do we get that across to people? Politicians and planners, I have learned, are really short on understanding that everything is connected and a part of a whole, a living system.
We are a small transitional organization. We're not trying to build our own organization. We're trying to facilitate the work of others and at some point get out of the way. But we're not going to stop until we feel like we've made some success. We appreciate the resources and the innovation of all. We're just somehow trying to be, let's get real about what's really required to implement a triple bottom line approach. It's not enough to just say you've done it, or to do, this is going to produce this many widgets or something. We need to establish these new economies. We need to get the community involved and responsible. And then obviously we need to see how badly we have interfered with natural processes and try to bring most of them back.
That we're going to have to find a way to pay to manage our forests, to kind of back up what Bob was saying. And we can see what's happening is a cascade of forest loss across the West that we can anticipate is going to increase in severity and pace. And we can see that firefighting can't cut it. And we can also see that conservation and passive stewardship is also not cutting it. And so we have to learn how to be beneficial disruptors. We have to understand the loss of native ecological knowledge and their role as beneficial disruptors. And we have to learn quickly how to do that in a sensitive and non-appropriative way. We're having tremendous ecological losses. And so we really, in this moment, have to reevaluate our cultural values, because we haven't approached this landscape in a spirit of reciprocity or respect for all species, or understanding that we can't continue to mine any sort of resource, whether it's timber or salmon or gold. It can no longer be an extractive approach.
So the new approach and the focus and unique efforts of TALS is what they refer to as natural enterprise complexes. And these then are essentially a necessary outcome that will help contribute to that ultimate wildfire resilience goal. But achieving even one functional NEC involves many intermediate outcomes. You need to have the right folks involved. You need to know what the results and benefits are. You need to understand which treatments are needed where and what priorities there are. You need to figure out what are possible funding streams and governance mechanisms. And you need a mosaic of NECs across a landscape that will encompass various beneficiary pools and communities to ultimately serve the resilience need.
Our county governments are probably not totally equipped to do this. They're not as intensive as city government systems. And so somehow we have to step into that breach where there is less government organization and bring people together to address these questions.
It's fabulous, because something I heard from what Bob was messaging and what you added, like we've been using the air quality benefits,
right,
without paying for it. We've been getting the water supply and water quality benefits without paying for it.
Right.
We've been getting the peace of mind that, like, I get to look at that forest, but I live in Coffee Park. Yeah, guess what? Now the forest is coming to you in the form of ember.
Right.
That's interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, the money is in the cities, and this work is in the rural areas.
Yep.
And so effectively the cities have to pay the rural areas to get the work done, whether it's an economic, system or however it's set up, like that's where the money needs to go from where it is. TAL's approach is to think of landscapes as, we've been using the term natural enterprise complexes, but it's really kind of meant to key into the fact that these need to be sustainable communities, sustainable ecologies, and policy governance need to support this kind of long-term approach. So what we see is the first key to setting this in motion is organizing groups, existing groups like fire safe councils or firewise communities, organizing them to scale up and join forces and take action to work together on a landscape scale. So for example, in our Diamond Mountain Mark West project, that means bringing information, analysis, and decision-making tools and processes to hundreds of landowners on 72,000 acres roughly, and the parcels range from maybe 1 acre to several hundred to up to 1,000. So we're really organizing community-based and and supported discussions and decisions that integrate wildfire risk reduction, treatment typologies, placement of access and evacuation routes, permitting strategies, and then long-term stable funding. So we identify all of those things as being key structural elements to support this holistic approach.
How can we proactively see opportunities in the landscape and take an enterprise-based approach to increasing the revenue that could be generated by our forest treatments? What can we do with the waste products or the byproducts of forest thinning that enhance our local community's economy? How can the folks who need to bear the brunt of the expense have a financing mechanism that provides incentives for them to get that work done, because the work they do on their property will benefit everyone downwind?
I mean, I think it's important to recognize that the market can be your friend. I mean, the market is not capitalism necessarily or big business. And it's really a part of governance. And I was watching, I pulled up an ad online the other day for this car insurance company that, the tagline is only pay for what you use or only pay for what you get. And I think that is really the message we have to send out to everybody. You have to pay for the nature you use, what you take from it, what you put into it, and you need to respect it. And I know the market turns a lot of people off, but as disoriented as everybody is and so on, I think coming together in that way is really important. So I really hope we can all be into these kinds of techniques that just bring us together against the right signals and costs and risks and benefits.
Hi, everybody. Today I'm going to be giving some examples of enterprise-based programs that WRA has helped develop. And I'm also going to be going over a threats analysis tool that we found to be really instrumental in designing these types of programs. So one example of an enterprise-based program is the Santa Cruz Mountains Carbon Cooperative in Santa Cruz County, California. This is a program that WRA helped develop in partnership with Semper Virens Fund, which is California's oldest land trust. And this program essentially leverages the carbon market to incentivize small private forest landowners to conserve their forest and implement improved forest management practices. So landowners enroll in the program, they abide by the conservation rules and implement certain practices, and then in turn, they are paid for the carbon credits that they are generating. In this way, the program is set up to be financially self-sustaining over time. And because it's an aggregated program, it allows forest landowners who have relatively small properties to be able to participate in the carbon market, whereas on their own, they wouldn't be able to have a financially viable project. So to give you a sense of the scope and geography of the program, this is a map of Santa Cruz County that Semper Virens Fund put together. And all of the orange parcels represent lands that are potentially eligible to participate in the program. They're all currently unprotected, zoned for timber production. So there is that element of additionality if they were to enroll. They're larger than 40 acres in size. And it amounts to 38,000 acres across this area. And the program actually could be expanded even beyond Santa Cruz County. But as you can see, a lot of these properties are near already protected lands, and as you could imagine, are valuable from an ecological or connectivity standpoint. So again, this is an example of a program that utilizes environmental markets to achieve conservation benefits and be financially self-sustaining over time. Another program that WRA has worked on that we would consider an enterprise-based program is the Peaks to People Water Fund in Northern Colorado. And this one we would consider an avoided cost model, because basically entities pay for forest health treatments that are intended to reduce wildfire risk and the associated risks of sedimentation and damage to water supplies. So they're paying to reduce risk to avoid those costs of having to clean up water supplies in the event of a fire and extreme sedimentation. And this is the schematic from the Peaks to People website that basically just shows what I just described. So you have your downstream water users that are paying money and providing resources and assistance to the upstream stewards who are implementing practices like forest thinning that reduce wildfire risk. And by doing that, they preserve the water that is used by the downstream communities. So again, this is another example of a program that is intended to be financially self-sustaining, using those funds, collecting and using those funds over time to finance forest health treatments. So one of our lessons learned in designing these types of programs is that it's really important to dig into the threats to the community and really map those out before you get into designing your solution or your enterprise-based program. So we typically use this tool in working with community stakeholders to dig into threats. And it simply works like this. So we start out on the right-hand side, defining the outcome, the chief outcome that you're trying to avoid in your community. And maybe that's threats to your water supply, or maybe it's catastrophic fire that's ending up leading to casualties, human casualties. And then working backwards, you then detail what are all of the conditions and events that lead to this outcome. And building it out even further, what are all the factors that create those conditions and events? And so just going through this process with stakeholders really forces groups to dig into the nitty-gritty, cause and effect relationships between one factor and another that is part of this results chain. So to give you an example, if we use that a program like that Peaks to People Water Fund, maybe the chief outcome that you're trying to avoid is water quality impacts and cost to your community, having to clean up the water system. Working backwards, what are the conditions and events that lead to that contamination of your water quality? We have your flooding, erosion, and sedimentation, your catastrophic wildfire. In this particular case, the wildfire stems from overgrown forests and lack of effective fuels treatment at scale. Again, these factors, I'm just running through them quickly now, but these are items that we would really explore with stakeholder groups and vet and look to the science and studies that have been done in the community to see what are the main contributing factors here. And then building out even further, I won't go through all of these, but why are we having lack of effective fuels treatment at scale in the community? It might be because there's a pure lack of capacity. Maybe there just aren't enough skilled contractors to do the work. Maybe the treatments need to happen on private lands, and there aren't those relationships with landowners to make it happen. Maybe we just can't get to the treatment areas. There's a lack of roads or bridges that can accommodate the equipment. And then, of course, funding, I think, is often an issue, but I think sometimes funding is just really one piece of the puzzle, and it's important to really dig into these other factors. And again, I won't go through all of these, but walking it back even further, something like, something like a shortage of skilled contractors is contributing to your lack of capacity. So maybe that means then your strategy or one of your strategies needs to be designed around training contractors. And that's something that might get missed if you aren't doing this kind of detailed threats analysis. So then once we do our threats analyses with community groups, we then turn to designing the solution, and we use a similar framework that basically turns the threats analysis on its head, or kind of mirrors all of those factors that we just talked through. Again, starting on the right-hand side, instead of with your chief goal, your chief threat, focusing on your main goal, and then working your way backwards to what are the outcomes that you need to achieve in order to get to your goal, what are the intermediate outcomes, working all the way back to your activities. And something we see often is that groups have a tendency to start with the activities, start on the left-hand side instead of the right-hand side, and that can sometimes lead to some inefficiencies and lack of buy-in from the community, or just maybe the wrong activities that are misguided and not really pegged to attacking the threats that you need to be working on mitigating. So to give you another example of how we would use the goal oriented framework, using that same program example of the water fund, we start on the right-hand side. And so if our main threat was trying to avoid impacts to water quality, on the other hand, our goal is that the source water is protected and that your costs are avoided. Working backwards, in order to get to that point of protecting source water, we need to make sure that the treatments are implemented and are actually reducing fire risk. How do we get to that point of effective treatments? We have priority sites that are being treated at scale. And then just going off of the example I was working with before, maybe one of your chief activities here is that landowner outreach and engagement to make sure that the treatments can happen in the high priority places. Up here in this gold box, I just want to point out that when we went through this exercise with our TALS team, they had a similar case in Lake Sonoma where they're working on fire risk reduction and source water protection, and going through this exercise really helped them define their key role among all of these different pieces and activities that were going on in order to achieve the ultimate goal. So for them, their key strengths were making the case for recurring investment, engaging with funders, doing that stakeholder engagement with contractors and landowners. So this gold box just kind of defines their focal area among the overall framework. So that wraps up our enterprise-based program design examples and the threats analysis and design solution tools. Thanks.
So Jane gave us a couple of examples of enterprise-driven programs and shared a little bit about how that threats analysis and results chain thinking can help us identify and prioritize steps that can produce useful and synergistic outcomes. So here's just like an excerpt, a reminder from some of the process graphics we created for TALS, showing outcomes that are required to support creation of a functional NEC. And I'm just going to illustrate backing up to fill in more of the pieces for this type of results chain. So if we just look at one of the many specific activities that contribute to the outcome step, if we go back through the intermediate outcome of feasible enterprise funding, then there's a lot of intermediate outputs that come from lots of different activities. And funding is just one of the components to get that NEC functional. But finding a means to sustainably fund ongoing treatment is an absolute must, and it's the cornerstone of the TALS perspective and contribution to solutions. Now, even if you do figure out funding and you know how you're going to pay for things, And we have good science that provides us the knowledge and tools to know what to do and where to do it. There are other constraints and impediments, of course. And as part of strategic efforts in California, one of those is very serious to make sure that we understand the complex regulatory overlays. So I don't want to act like all you got to do is figure out the money and everything else will come, because there are certain things that have different degrees of constraints, even if they are the most important activities to carry out. Anyway, let's wrap up by hearing a few panelists' comments on gains, progress, and remaining gaps and challenges.
Governance, should not just be filled in by government. There's a lot of work that the private sector can do, individual investors, all the fire safe councils and so on. And I mean, we recognize that TALS really doesn't have the creds necessarily to move people forward, but we think in concert with CLE, we can move forward. And just in the last couple of days, I've gotten agreement from a couple other foundations to be involved in this effort. And so, to me, that's, after working on this for over 2 years in Sonoma County, this is the biggest breakthrough.
So while those short-term goals are key, they are only part of what we now need in this climate change time we're living in. We need to have these longer term goals, and politicians and planners are not, they may be starting to think that way, but we have a pace and a scale to deal with. And we need to all do what we can to inspire one another to work together and to get the job done as fast as possible and on a larger scale. And that's what TALS really concentrates on. But I do want to compliment some of our state legislators. Senator Dodd, Senator McGuire in particular, are working really hard on those issues. It's a sticky wicket, but they are looking at it at that important scale of the wildlife urban interface, and how can we work with the landowners now that own it to turn that around and not add more people or more houses in the wrong places.
When I think about what it would take to scale up and really meet the needs at the level that those needs are present on the landscape, I think about two interrelated issues, and those are science and funding. When it comes to science about forests and forest health in California, so much of the scientific data we have is about the Sierra Nevada region, which is very, very different from our coastal environments. Science is important to make the case to funders, and we just need more funding in general. The amounts of public funding that are going into this work in California are, I believe, larger than they've ever been before in terms of grant programs, and it's still a tiny fraction of what the need is out there. So we need more funding, and I believe also new funding models, because I think there is concern about the public footing the bill for management on private land, and that's reasonable. But there's also the reality that a lot of people that get into purchasing these private forested lands, huge management costs are not part of the equation of what they're planning on when they purchase that land. And that's an education issue. That's something that needs to change over time. But in the meantime, we need to have government funding support to help, shoulder some of the cost of that, so that work that's going on private land for the public good, for the resilience of our entire landscape, so that work is supported and able to happen.
it's incredibly difficult in the face of impending threats and disasters to realize that we still need to sometimes go slow to go fast. And there's so much urgency about getting work on the ground, and resources are coming in terms of financial resources, but nobody really wants to spend time planning. And what we really need are comprehensive plans at scale, and to take the time to develop those plans and to also be funded to plan, not just implement, so that we can deal with things like environmental compliance.
So in conclusion, I just want to comment a little bit about the fact that, you've heard a lot about things we think are making progress, and still, high awareness of the peril we're facing at local and regional, nearly continental scale. And I want to wrap up by noting that this work is not purely a scientific, technical, or professional endeavor for me. I've been personally fortunate, but in the last few years, wildfires have been at my doorstep, required repeated evacuations. They've heightened the pandemic era anxiety, degraded air quality, health, happiness in my communities. They've also burned the site and watershed of one of my team's dam removal, fish habitat restoration projects just 3 days after it was constructed. And that's a project for fish recovery that's been 20 years in the making. So I'm all in for all aspects of working on wildfire resilience. I'm really grateful for the contributions of the panelists, and there's their websites here if you want to learn more about them. And now we'll happily discuss any questions that the audience might have. I'm sure it was a good conversation because I was there. Anyway, thanks for taking the time to look at our video recording, and hope that it's very helpful.